Ukraine today is seizing the momentum on the battlefield. And it's not just on the battlefield located in Ukraine, but also the one now in Russia. This all started with Ukrainian forces successfully retaking the 7 settlements in Donetsk. You saw the big news. There were 160 square kilometers or 62 square miles that are now firmly back under Ukrainian control. But these gains, near Pokrovsk and Dobropillia, they're leading to something else. First, this is cutting Russia off from their supply lines. Those were the very supply corridors that Russia needs for its artillery. These advances of, say, 5 kilometers or 3 miles, they flip which side is able to fire first. Each kilometer gained means new positions, new routes, and new pressures on the Russian logistics. Ukrainian airstrikes, though, are doing something else. They're reinforcing the ground gains. Strikes hit Russian positions and the ammunition in the Luhansk region. The frontline village there was where Russia had been stockpiling all of its weaponry, all of its artillery. But now that stockpile, it is smoldering ash. Ukraine's goal here is quite clear. It's quite obvious. It is to degrade the forward positions and to cut immediate firepower. Ukraine has been continuously, of course, attempting to cut off the Russian supply lines. But the attacks recently have become increasingly more successful. And we see the results. We see that Russian troops are being forced back. They are retreating. This is something new. This is a shift. Keep in mind, just a couple weeks ago, we were still talking about the Russian summer offensive. But now we're talking about Russian retreats. My name is Jason Smart, and I'm a special correspondent for the Kyiv Post and a national security advisor. And what we see is, yet again, that logistics are what win wars. And Ukraine is depriving Russia of having functioning logistics. Just look at the operations that they've been carrying out to dismantle Russian logistics in the Kursk region. These are things for which Russia was wholly unprepared, that they were not anticipating. And despite the fact that Russia was shocked and Russia cannot believe this happening, it is not picked up in the Western press. Neither is it picked up that Ukraine is attacking yet every day more refineries. So help me get the truth to more people of what's really happening in this war. The fact that Ukraine is winning. It is Russia that is losing. Help me get this to the West. And you can do it simply. Just like this video, subscribe to this channel, and consider becoming a channel member today. So let's look at these different attacks. Let's look at Ukraine's special operations that hit the logistics hub of Russia's 810th Naval Infantry Brigade in Hiryi. The 810th is, of course, an elite Marine unit, but it was pressed into serving infantry roles due to the lack of manpower in the Russian military. But today, we see something else is going on. Those soldiers, those elite Marines, they're in a very difficult position because today, they don't have ammunition. They don't have storage areas. The concealed sites where they kept their weapons, where they had their vehicles, they were also hit. The brigade's tempo now has slowed. Its turnaround times are increasing, and the pressure on the northern axis is easing. Ukraine is on the precipice of making yet more gains. Ukraine is putting Russia into a position from which it cannot defend itself, from which it cannot maintain its current positions. Look at the huge news just in the past few hours that Ukraine is cutting Russia off from more of its supplies, cutting off the tap from which the money comes that pays for supplies. Because without money, it's even better than a HIMARS attack on Russian artillery. Because without money, there will be no more artillery, there will be no more weapons, and there will be no more Russian soldiers. So these deep strikes inside of Russia are turning the rear into a liability. And when we see this occur, we see these attacks by Ukrainian drones hitting the Saratov refinery. That's 610 kilometers, 380 miles from Ukraine. Or we see the attack that just happened as well at the other refinery in Samara region. That's 900 kilometers or 560 miles from Ukraine. These attacks are significant because they're leading to something else. Now, of course, cutting Russia's ability to refine oil is a great objective, and that is something that will continue. But there is another aspect of this. These losses, it's all of a sudden found to be very expensive to supply its own soldiers, to ship its artillery or to ship shells or whatever it needs to the soldiers. So what it has to do is pay more. But it's going to pay a lot more very soon because it appears that Ukraine is poised to begin attacking the convoys that go from places that are considered to be safe to the front line. But those convoys that are 10 hours or 12 hours from the front, that are perhaps the distance of a refinery to Ukraine, well, if you have 10 or 12 hours in a convoy and Ukraine has shown they can already strike a refinery that's even further away, why can Ukraine not also strike the convoys? Why cannot strike the position side of Russia that are preparing to send more supplies to the front? And Ukraine is doing that. It is preparing the trap. Ukraine is putting into position the Russians so that they will make decisions that will work against them. Time again, we've seen that Ukraine is innovative. We've seen that cheap Ukrainian innovations are able to outpace the expensive Russian mess, the expensive Russian solutions that don't actually fix anything. Ukraine is able to use the field interceptors, the FPV drones, such as the Flamingo family, such as the VB-140. These are the small camera-guided drones, the ones that fly like a video game and crash into enemy drones. They make air defense very cheap. They make it modular. They make it scalable. But for the Russians, they don't have anything similar. They don't have something like this that is protecting the infantry or protecting their logistics or ensuring that their ground gains are able to stick. A cheap drone that destroys an expensive weapon is the math that wins a long war. So how does Russia respond to this, though? How does Russia respond to the fact that not only is it losing Ukraine, but it's clearly losing inside of Russia as well? Vladimir Putin, of course, mocks the West. He wishes to show that he does not care and he does not fear escalation. But Putin here is only imitating strength. The Russian provocations that we've seen are actually signaling weakness. For instance, the 3 MiG-31s that violated Estonian airspace near Tallinn, they loitered near the islands for about 12 minutes with their transponders and their radios turned off. Of course, we saw that the NATO F-35s were able to scramble to intercept them. Now, what's interesting about this is something different, though. It's probably not a surprise that Russia does this. It's not the first time, and it's undoubtedly not the last. Russian jets, of course, would argue that they are trying to protect their regional hubs. They have, for instance, the Petro-Baltic oil and gas platform in the Baltic Sea. But the reality is, it's not about these hubs. It's not about a desire to provide security for anything Russian. It's rather an attempt to intimidate the West, to show the West that Russia is not fearful. But Russia would not do that in normal conditions. But why now? Why all of a sudden, right now, do we see more Russian drones going to Europe? Why the mix? Well, they're interrelated. Russia cannot defend its homeland. It's losing territory on the front. There is no position right now for Russia that is safe. There is nothing that is going well for Russia at all. And so it must show that it's strong. It must give some sort of demonstration of force. So it takes very little risk and realizes by flying some planes over NATO territory, that will capture the headlines. Nobody will talk about the fact that Russia is losing. But that's why we need to stop this game. We must not allow Russia to control the narrative. And NATO must publish very clear and simple rules that every pilot and every controller can follow. They must understand that if they were to choose to enter the territory, they will be shot down. Flying over NATO territory makes you an intruder, and intruders get shot. For those who might think it creates escalation, quite the opposite. We've seen that Vladimir Putin is terrified of any real chance of escalation. Look at the precedent set by Turkey back in 2015 when it shot down a Russian Su-24 after repeated warnings. That made it very clear that you do not fly anymore over the airspace of Turkey. This protects civilians, it prevents accidents, and it prevents Russia from doing these stunts. These things that are a risk, in fact, for Russia as well. But Russia will continue to do this because it does not fear escalation. It does not fear the true risk that is posing to global security. And that's why once we shoot down 1 or 2 Russian jets, they will stop flying over NATO airspace. We should have no sympathy and we should not have any patience. Rules are rules. And as Russia thought it could roll into Ukraine and not face consequences, it believes it can challenge NATO today. It believes it can cause NATO to rethink sending air support to Ukraine by causing it to keep the airspace in Europe to protect it from things such as its jets. The only way to stop that from happening The only way to prevent Russia from behaving with this savagery is to put Russia in its place. But Russia is, of course, very worried right now. And not because of this, though. It's worried because internally, inside of Russia, this situation is increasingly unstable. Just look what we saw near Moscow. Alexander Tunin, who is the head of Umatex, well, he was found dead next to his car. Of course, they said that there was a suicide letter left next to his side, but there is also something else that's worth knowing about him. One is that Umatex, his company, is part of Rosatom, Russia's only producer of carbon fiber. Carbon fiber is what is used to build aircrafts. It makes their frames or their tail stabilizers, their fuselages, the fuselages that are also used by the Garin and Shahed drones. So without it, Russia cannot sustain long-range drone production. But this death of this executive, it exposes how brittle Russia really is. One executive gone, he can in fact stall the entire supply chain because it's not clear what will happen next to that factory. Carbon fiber from a single source means that there's fewer drones, fewer shells, and delays at the front. But why this violence? Why right now, instead of Russia, do they kill their own defense suppliers? What is to be gained with that? Well, first, that silence, it might be very necessary for the Kremlin. They might be better off, in their view, to have a situation where nobody can talk. However, this is where the corruption of the Kremlin comes into play yet again. Of course, it is not in the interest of the Kremlin, in terms of Russia's security, to have him dead. But there are people who might have financial interest in seeing that. And as always, they put their interest ahead of Russia's interest. Keep in mind, this man, he would have very well understood the contracts, the procurement records, or the names of who were involved in the ongoing corruption in his sector. But without him, that means there will be no audits, no subpoenas, and leaking documents will become much more difficult. Because with him dies not only the man, but all of his documentation. It was all already taken. So what does this mean? What does this mean going ahead? Well, for the population as a whole, it serves as a sign. It serves as a sign for everybody that the CEOs are not safe. They are not secure. And if you're the FSB currently shaking down businesses, that's a very good sign to spread because you want the population to fear you. You want the elite to fear you. You want to operate like any other organized crime syndicate. You want to have total control and a monopoly. And right now, they're creating that. They're seizing assets. They're taking over contracts, and they are taking advantage of the massive corruption across Russia to take over things, these massive corporations that make things like carbon fiber. But there is something else as well. There's a fact that within Russia today, as we've discussed, there is less money to go around. There's less of ability for Russia to continue paying its bills. But for the elites, of course, they're not as worried about that. Yes, Russia is going bankrupt, but it's in fact their own economic security that they worry about. They're worried about how they will make money in an environment where there's less money to be made. And so we can expect in the coming weeks and months that the FSB will be behind more and more murders of people who are senior ranking officials in corporations involved with the defense industry. As they kill them, they will slowly take over all of those industries. They will appoint their friends, their relatives, become the directors of companies that then supply the Russian government. But throughout all this, Russia is not winning. Russia is losing. And what is going on back home, this squabbling, this fighting, is in fact draining Russia. Unfortunately, though Russia is consuming itself, cannibalizing itself, Ukraine continues to suffer. We see that Google has released updated satellites showing the imagery of Donetsk. We see that Marinka, for instance, a town that is horribly devastated, it had 620 days of fighting. The damage is visible. You could see yourself in high resolution what is visible from orbit. So while Russia is exporting terror, it is also at home spreading terror. But unfortunately, the wreckage of this terror is left in Ukraine. But at the end of this, what can we conclude? What do we see? Well, first, within Russia, it's not a good situation. Again, we see more evidence that the FSB is fighting with the military and those that supply it. Those who had for years undoubtedly been involved with bribes and corruption in the Russian military, who are giving contracts for kickbacks. But there's something else. we see the refineries are on fire. We see that within Ukraine, the Russians are losing supply lines. They are losing territory. The Russians are in an untenable situation. And this is all the while, in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin acts like he is strong, and he tries to send jets over NATO territory. And that is why we have to make sure he does not succeed in that. We have to make sure that there is continuous pressure. We must compound their losses. We must make sure there is more friction in their logistics and make sure there's greater battlefield attrition. Because ultimately, economic strain will force Moscow into public emergency measures. So the next days, the next hours, what we should expect is see more refinery strikes. And not only those, but also strikes on the convoys, the supplies going to the front. We should see more strain in the Russian economy. We should see more officials seeking to flee the country as they fear the infighting amongst the elites. But at this point, we see very clearly that Russia is not winning. Russia is losing. Thank you for watching. Please like this video. Please subscribe to this channel. And consider becoming a channel member today. You can also leave your comments below, which I love to read, and let me know what you think. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.